Welcome to the Archetypal Mosaic. This is Mikhail Tank. Today's guest is Davide De Angelis, also known as David De Angelis, an incredible graphic artist who has come up with an amazing new tarot deck based on his work with David Bowie. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mikhail. Really nice to be here.
David, please tell us the origin of your tarot idea.
Wow. How long have we got?
As long as you want.
As long as I want.
Yes.
Okay, well, the story actually begins probably when I was about 5 or 6, strangely enough. I kind of always, someone bought my mum a tarot deck back from, I think it was Africa of all places. And it was like I don't think it was actually an African tarot deck. I'm not sure whether Africa's got a tradition of tarot, but it might have been something that they got out there. And it kind of sat on our the sideboard as we have in England here. I don't know whether you have sideboards in the States, maybe you do. And I was always fascinated and I was always drawn to it. And so I used to take this deck down. It was packaged in a beautiful box. And I later found out it was called, it was based on a very ancient tarot deck, but it was done with very bright illustrations. And I've never been able to trace it since, actually. So that was the beginning for me. I was absolutely captivated by these images and what they could possibly mean, and why on earth would anyone go to all the trouble of creating 78 unique images to try and represent something. So that kind of followed me through my life. So in a sense, I actually talk about this a little bit in the book that comes with the tarot deck.
Sure.
It's about feeling that this idea of a tarot deck or something of that capacity was actually following me through life. Not kind of stalking me in a bad way, but it was kind of always there in the background. And then when I started working creatively with David Bowie, it was a little bit like the lid was opened further on that. And if you look at for example, the album Outside, there's a whole book that comes with that, and a whole series of graphics that came with that particular album.
I have that album, and it has I'm Deranged on it, my favorite song from Lost Highway, right?
Yeah, it's funny, that's my favorite song too. So as we worked on the ideas for that, and we talked about various things, some of the early references that I brought up in the artwork, some of the sketches actually contain references to tarot, and because it was a very dystopian kind of album, and it was quite dark and pessimistic in places, and yet it had this sort of this sort of vision of a future that was possibly trying to come through. So in a sense, I always saw the work that this was my interpretation. This is, by the way, this is what Bowie actually directly said to me. Just in us working together, I really got a sense that there was kind of a divinatory nature to that particular album, and very strongly the idea of how to introduce some element of the tarot came through in the artwork, and some of it even unconsciously, funnily enough, because I look back on it now, and strangely enough, there's even a whole website that I found just dedicated to tarot references in the Outside album artwork. So that's quite funny. So the kind of idea for creating a tarot deck was heightened when I was working with him on that particular album in 1995. And the deeper we went into kind of creating what I would term as a kind of visual vocabulary, a way of telling stories with images, a way of using typography, a way of using lettering and letter forms. And at one point, we toyed with the idea of kind of creating an outside deck of cards, kind of an outside divinatory deck of cards, and it didn't actually transpire because we also figured out that it was an incredible amount of work to do that, and there just wasn't the scope to do that. So obviously that got batted away, and then I started to sketch ideas for a tarot deck way back then, and it was really kind of feeding off the methodology that I worked with Bowie on, and like I said, that kind of that visual vocabulary. So that was really the seed, or the kind of seed mother of the deck in a sense. And
now, tell me this. How would you describe your particular art form? Like in the musical stuff, mine is called Dark Soul. It's always been called Dark Soul Theater since I was 13. You have a very unique style to what you do. What would you call it, and how is it different from many other graphics out there?
Wow, that's an interesting question. It's probably the most difficult thing to look at something that you do and define it. I mean, just to put it in context, maybe context is a possibly a more accurate way to give you an answer on that. I kind of cut my teeth in London in the 70s, so I'm kind of an old dude in that respect. I was a teenager when punk hit London, Sex Pistols, all of that kind of vibe. And my very first experience of creating anything was when I was at school. I was creating literally singles covers back in those days, vinyl singles covers for the kind of punk bands that have all kind of disappeared now off the face of the earth. So my background was very much sort of punk, then new wave. That's kind of a Freudian slip there, isn't it? So very much this kind of idea of kind of destroying things and then creating something out of the things that, whatever's been destroyed forms into something else. So very much, even the artwork for the tarot deck is very much based on that. So it's taking things that would initially be seen as things that have fallen apart and creating a new form out of those. And that was very much how I approach creating art. I normally have no idea what I'm going to do until I start doing it, and I don't plan things, and I very much let the process itself unfold. So I would say that I'm kind of a kind of punk new age typographer, image maker.
Beautiful. Now tell me, what kind of programs do you choose to do? Are they all graphical, like in terms of back in '95 when you worked with Bowie and some other additional covers? We'll talk about Bowie in a bit. And the current tarot deck, what kind of software do you prefer to use?
You know what, a lot of the decks actually kind of just me drawing stuff and kind of pulling stuff out of things that I've done and things that I see, just walking around with my camera in the streets, traveling around. I kind of see a shape, or I see, kind of a part of a face or something that interests me, and I'll just take that and then I'll work into it, sometimes by hand, and then just kind of scan those things in. In terms of the actual software I use, it's kind of all the kind of same bag of tricks as most people, really. It's kind of Photoshop, Illustrator, some 3D Studio, those kind of things. I'm kind of like Photoshop. I'm one of those people that I never ever. I probably shouldn't say this. Adobe would come chasing after me. Back in the old days, I could never afford to buy Photoshop when I was like, kind of a young starting out designer. So I sort of started out with it was in the days when you could do really easily pirate stuff. So my stuff was always like pirated. And so I never had the manuals for anything. So I've kind of learned Photoshop in the most ridiculously weird way. And I see people that know how to use this program properly. Same with Illustrator. And, I seem to have my own kind of idiosyncratic way of using that thing. So Photoshop's a big plus. Illustrator, I almost can't stand that program, but I love what it can enable me to do. Those are kind of like, a basic a 3D package that just allows me to do some 3D work that I need to if it comes into the mix, and Illustrator and Photoshop. So there's no sort of secret bag of tricks other than the stuff that I actually do by hand.
And I'm sure you purchase all your software now, right?
Yeah, I do now. I'm a little bit too public to get away with.
Good. Now tell me this: in terms of the cards, the 78 cards, of course, 78 being a special birth year, but why 78 cards, and what about the archetypal symbols chosen for those 78 cards? And also, it's a triple question. Your limited edition deck has one extra card. What is it, and how did you choose to add it?
Well, and I'll answer the last question first. I'd probably have to kill you if I told you the answer before it's released. How do I go about doing it? I mean, firstly, what I would say is that I don't profess to be any kind of guru or Svengali on tarot. I literally do stand on the shoulders of giants, and first off, my publisher, Lo Scarabeo, they really are the shoulders of giants, and other people that I've worked with over the years just to kind of educate me. So, first off, I would say that I'm probably the worst person to ask about kind of the actual mechanics of tarot. I mean, although I could sort of recite the orders of things and why I think things are there and why they should be there or whatever, I'm probably 100% wrong on so much of that. So, the answer to those other two questions is that I'm sure there's some really smart answers, but I don't have them. So, I kind of reveal I'm happy to admit my ignorance on those areas. The only thing I will say is that over the time that I've been involved with just kind of working with the tarot, and then latterly, very deeply involved with creating the Starman Tarot. What I found is that the tarot actually it is a whole universe. It's a whole vocabulary in and of itself. And once you start to engage with it on a very intimate level, it communicates with you. So that's very much how I operate with the tarot. I let it speak to me, and then I'm guided as if it were to do the things that I do with it. So I'm not someone who is well schooled on tarot at all. Okay,
great. Now, tell me about your tarot particularly. Do you have any favorite cards or images, like Death, the Hangman? Do you have any favorites?
I think one of my favorites is it's difficult to say whether it's a favorite or not, but it's one that sort of stuck with me, and it's the Five of Swords. And it's the kind of the willingness to sort of sacrifice everything in order to kind of get what you want. And I mean, I could explain that a little bit more if you want. I don't want to kind of
certainly. Please do.
Yeah, it's the interesting thing is that it'd be very easy for me to say that all of this just kind of came to me, and even my relationship with David Bowie and my creative work that I did with him over the years, that in a sense, I'm quite an edgy person on that level, and life doesn't just, and art and creativity doesn't just flow to me, and I tend to find that I'm kind of at my edge and at my best when I'm really uncomfortable. And interestingly, with working with Bowie, I found that I had to get myself really to a point of being, I know we're going to come on to talking about Bowie, but just on this particular note, I really was uncomfortable, and actually creating this tarot deck, it kind of took me to the lowest points, possibly I've been for many, many years, and conversely took me to the highest points too. But the interesting thing is that when you have 78 very highly individual pieces of art, I mean, some tarot isn't like that, but this particular one is. I mean, every card is kind of like a mini drama. It was like an entire journey that was partly relentless, at times. And there were occasions when I had to sort of say, well, look, this has become so tough, and it's not like missiles were flying over my head like they are for some people, but just psychologically, physically, emotionally, spiritually even, it took me to such low points at times that I really had to kind of say, well, look, am I going to finish this thing? Is it going to finish me? And what is it that I'm prepared to sacrifice in order to finish this? And the Five of Swords really got me at a point where I was actually at my lowest ebb. And I openly admit that I was like, incredibly depressed and down when this particular card came upon me. And it was the one that sort of, it was kind of like the turning point, strangely enough, in the creation of the deck. And I kind of felt, well, if I can create something from this point, then I really know that I'm onto something with this deck, and I really know that it's speaking to me in a particularly powerful way. So that card literally sort of jumps out of me, and funnily enough, whenever I've done a reading for myself, I nearly always get that card. No matter how hard I shuffle that deck, that card just seems to keep jumping out of me to kind of remind me of the fact, I think it was Ernest Hemingway I first heard it from, that you really don't have to feel good in order to create your best work. So that's kind of, hopefully that answers that question.
Oh yeah, that's the best answer ever, because it's so, you went through it, you've lived through the cards, you lived with the cards, with the creation of them. That's spectacular. Two more questions before we get to working with Bowie. The first one is, looking at your deck, I visualized that it would be a fantastic deck for virtual reality tarot. I was wondering, have you been asked to do that, or have you considered having your tarot be virtual reality?
You know what? I'm absolutely into that. That would be something that I'm completely open to, and I feel that it would so work with the way that the images and the symbology of the deck is structured. So I haven't been approached by anyone, and I would love to be approached. So if you know someone that's kind of in that realm, or anyone listening, then please feel free. I would, I'm completely fascinated by that whole sphere of creativity, and I feel that there's so much possibility that's kind of encrypted into that way of working and that way of exploring reality. So I would I would absolutely love for the deck to find its way forward into these really cutting edge ways of exploring of reality and sensory perceptions and such like. Yeah,
I think yours would be the perfect mega deck for that. Okay, here's a double final question about the tarot deck itself. The first part of the question is how much of the imagery is based on Bowie, and the other question is, are there indeed 3 variations of this deck? There's the one with the book, the one with the booklet, and the limited edition with the extra card, or are there more? And can you describe all of these things?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's a long and a short answer to that. I'll start with the short answer first, really. There's kind of versions of, commercially, there's only 3 particular versions of this deck, and all of the cards in all of them are pretty much identical, except the size, and I think the back of the card is different on the kit version and the ordinary deck version. The kind of additional card is kind of an interesting thing, because it's kind of a variation on another piece of art that's already in the deck, and it was something that I kind of experimented with and didn't know whether to include it, and I just felt it was a really strong image, but I couldn't find its position within the deck. And then suddenly I thought, well, maybe it's the 79th card, so that's kind of how that ended up. In terms of actual, so there's only the 3 kind of sets that are commercially available. In terms of how many times I've probably designed this deck, it'd probably be about 12 times over. So, throughout the history of the time I started working on it way back in 95, I mean, there's just so many bits and pieces of this deck that are scattered across those years that I almost just, don't think about it really. And most of them have kind of ended up in the sort of the annuals of it's kind of digital annuals now, isn't it? Sort of stored on hard drives and scattered through portfolios over the years and what have you. So, if I had to root stuff out, it would probably be an immense kind of cartography of all the bits that have kind of ended up in the final deck. But in terms of what's available to the public, there's those 3 versions of the deck available. The limited edition is really exactly what it says. It contains, apart from the additional card, it contains another element that I don't really want to talk about until it's released, that people will find hopefully very interesting, that opens another whole kind of insight into what's gone on over those years, and also an insight into the kind of the creative vocabulary, like I was talking about earlier, that I built up with Bowie in terms of working with him. So that's kind of what's available. Mm-hmm. I mean, one day I may just kind of open up the floodgates and just say, well, okay, I'm just going to share everything that this deck ever was. But probably, I think my wife would have to kill me then if I decided.
And what about the imagery in the deck? How much of it do you think is related in one way or another to Bowie himself?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I'm sure that's one that I'm going to get asked a lot. And the thing is with this whole thing that I've been very, very careful in creating this, that I don't want it to be a David Bowie tarot deck, mm-hmm. and it's not. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely not a David Bowie tarot deck. Mm-hmm. So if there's people expecting to see loads of pictures of David Bowie and stuff like that, they're going to be really disappointed, because in a sense what I'm interested in is kind of the archetype of the Starman, mm-hmm. in many ways, I mean, kind of, you could say, in not in every way either. I'm sure he wouldn't say that. But Bowie embodied in the way he worked and his creative approach to things, and also, all of his personas that he created over the years. There was kind of an embodiment of that archetype, the Starman. The idea of someone waiting in the sky, he'd like to come and see us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. That kind of thing. So it's almost like the avatar that's waiting to come to Earth or rise in consciousness in order to take us to a different level, or a different level of understanding or seeing. So that was something that was always very strong when I was working with Bowie, that kind of the sense of that archetype, and that's the core of the deck. So I was never ever trying to sort of make a deck that's about David Bowie. This isn't about David Bowie. And also because really out of my respect for him as a person, I just want to keep that sense of what we share together as something that we share together, and I've always been very careful over the years not to divulge anything other than just our creativity that we shared. So
that's beautiful. I can now see why the last album and the album cover Black Star and was also related to Starman as well. It's the kind of the Dark Star. Now let me ask you specifically about Bowie. You have met him and worked with him face to face, yes?
Yeah.
For a period of how long?
Okay, so I first met Bowie, I mean, this is a strange story, which I actually met Bowie when I was about 10 years old, funnily enough, in London. And my dad used to manage a restaurant in Soho, London. I know you have Soho in New York, but I could say, well, London got there first, but I'm sure it would. And he actually came into the restaurant my dad was managing, and it was kind of round the corner from where Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars was recorded. And it was kind of like in a flash he came in, and he had, I can't even remember whether he had, I don't think he had anything to eat. I can't remember his culinary choices, but and I knew who he was. My mum was really into David Bowie big time, and my dad used to get people in. It was in the middle of the West End of London, and he was kind of managing this restaurant. He used to kind of stay open late, and like even the police used to come in and have feast on Italian food and red wine, and so they weren't that stringent on the archaic UK licensing laws back then. So a lot of celebrities, after they'd finished, shows or visiting people in London, would actually end up in my dad's restaurant. So he used to come home with, I remember one night he came home with Steve McQueen's autograph, and another night he would come home with Elizabeth Taylor's autograph or Richard Burton. It was kind of that era. And, on this particular night, I was actually in that restaurant. My mum had actually dumped me off there because she had to go to a meeting. And reluctantly, my dad, he was busy, and he sort of put me at the back of the restaurant with a big sheet of paper to draw on. And that particular night, David Bowie came into the restaurant with another person, and they sat at the back, right where I was sitting. So that was kind of my first ever encounter with Bowie. And then kind of track forward probably about, I can't remember how many years now, but 20 odd years later, then I've kind of almost forgotten your question. I'm just kind of driving.
Oh, certainly. My question was, what was the period of time that you collaborated with David Bowie, and what were the collaborations?
Okay, yeah. So track forward to that 20 years later, in London, and I was running my own company with one of my best friends at the time, a guy called Derek Scanlon, and we set up a kind of avant-garde design company called De Novo. and we were working in a district called Islington in London, which was kind of like an up-and-coming artistic sort of district at that time, which is kind of now one of these sort of trendy districts in London. But at the time, it was still a place where you could be an artist and still afford to be there. Mm-hmm. So that would have been, I first met Bowie again in 1994 when he contacted me, having seen some work that I'd done that had been featured in a magazine. And he had been handed, I think it was one of the, I can't remember what magazine that was, I should remember this, but something like Creative Technology or Creative Review or something like that. Anyway, Bowie saw that and he contacted me. This was in 1994, and he was kind of I think he was already sort of planning the album Outside. And so we kind of met up then, and he presented to me lots of different ideas and stuff like that. So our actual working relationship went from then through to the Earthling album, which was, I think, 1997. And then there on after, we worked on different things, because I then left that company that I was running, and I started doing other stuff myself. One of them was writing a science fiction novel, which Bowie actually wrote something for the cover for, which was, so we kind of kept up a dialogue, and every so often I'd get a call from him and we'd do something together. We did some fine artwork together, which was sold through a particular gallery in London, and I think New York as well. So it's probably about 7 years that I was actually in touch with Bowie fairly regularly, and then there on after less regularly, and really when he sort of dropped out. He became a dad again, and he sort of dropped out of doing things on that level. Maybe I'd hear from him every Christmas or something. So that's kind of the span.
That's very fascinating. A few follow-ups on that. So there were 3 album covers. There was Reality, Earthling.
I didn't work on the Reality one. I just did the Outside and Earthling. Those were the only 2 albums that I worked on with him in terms of graphics.
The Earthling is a gorgeous cover with him standing in that gorgeous coat, right? The gold red one.
Alexander McQueen. Yeah.
Oh wow! So those 2 album covers. Did you also design the singles for those albums?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the singles. Also, and there was going back to the Outside album, that was kind of like in a sense a sort of relaunch of Bowie. I mean, he'd done various things like Tin Machine and stuff like that, and the Outside album was really kind of, in a sense, him reuniting with Brian Eno as a producer, and it was kind of like, I suppose, him coming back to himself as a solo performer, an artist. So I kind of was very happy to be working on that. It felt like a very significant point in his career. So
were you the main designer for both Outside and Earthling?
Well, like I said, I was working with De Novo, which was basically, we were a business, we were a company. So the Outside album was incredibly involved. I mean, it involved photo shoots, it involved tons and tons of, looking back on it now, part of it looks a little bit crude at times. I'm looking and seeing how the software was back in those days for doing things. But maybe that's kind of the charm that it has, in a sense. So I worked on that. There was a whole team of us that worked on it, really. So, there was a guy called John Scarisbrick, who was the photographer, myself, who really was kind of like doing the majority of the design work and the imaging and stuff like that. There was also my partner, Derek Scanlon, who worked on those elements with me. And there was other designers that we employed that were working with us that did other elements of the project too. So that was very much a kind of team of people working on it. The Earthling was very different. That was much more intimate, with just me and Bowie kind of working on ideas together.
Wow. A few questions about that. So when you said originally he contacted you, did he call you himself?
Yeah, that was so weird, you know. At the time, I was kind of, like I said, I was based in London, and we had a studio that we operated, and we had a receptionist working for us who was on this thing called work experience. So this is where you kind of give young people, you know, she wanted to see what it was like to be working in a design studio. Yeah, exactly. I was hunting for the word. And she was only like 16, so she was like, she's very young, she was very sweet, and one day she put a call through to my office, and she said, you know, David, I've got a Mr. David Bowie on the line for you. And I don't think she knew who on earth David Bowie was. She was completely sort of innocent and emotionless with it. And of course, my first reaction was that there was one of my friends playing a trick on me or something. And you know, I took the call, and literally it was like the lightning bolt, you know, the Bowie lightning bolt. It was so obviously David Bowie. It was startling and for a minute I was like, well, you know, I almost didn't know what to do. I nearly fell off the back of my chair. So yeah, that was the interesting thing about working with Bowie. He was incredibly intimate. He did everything himself. He didn't push anything off on anybody else when it came to working creatively. So that was my overall impression, and the shock of actually that first call with Bowie was really like quite stunning.
And just a few more questions. This is so interesting because I adore Bowie. Tell me, when you guys met originally, did he offer like a coffee shop, his office, and how did the first meeting go? What impression did you have of him as a creative person?
Yeah, great question. We had like I said, it was at a time when creatives could afford decent studios. So we had this like really beautiful studio. It was kind of all decked out and designed like Gaudi's, like a Gaudi temple. So Bowie came to our studio and had a meeting there. That was the first time that I encountered him in terms of that first meeting about the Outside album. So yeah, he kind of just rocked up at our studio and came in with a carrier bag full of bits, and we sat around a meeting table and literally just drank coffee and you know, went through everything. And he was probably there for about, I don't know, it seemed like forever, but I think it was probably about 4 hours. And you know, he had his PA was trying to prize him away, but you know, when he was focused on something creatively, you know, that's exactly what he was focused on. So yeah, so he came to our studio. Later I met him a couple of times in New York, and then again he met him in London.
As we begin to complete the interview, we have about 5 minutes left. I want to ask you just two more questions. The first one is, I have actually both the limited editions of Earthling and Outside. Both of them, Earthling has a hardcover digibook with very vibrant colors. They really pop out, and it really stands the test of time, the cover art. And Outside has that kind of a virtual reality video game kind of look. It also comes in a limited edition hardcover, but not as hard. It has kind of soft pages inside. It has some extra tracks, including the deranged versions and stuff. And I'm wondering, both of you, who decided, you know, about like the limited edition stuff, the hardcovers, the extra tracks, how the paper feels, and all of this stuff? Was it you, him, both?
It was really both. You know, Bowie was you know, incredibly intimately involved in the whole creative process. So you know, some people just can't believe it, that you know, that we would sit down and have a conversation about, the weight of the paper, or what finish was going to go on something, or whether it was going to be a special color or just done in 4-color and stuff like that. So everything was it always sounds paradoxical, because on one level he would give complete creative freedom, and he didn't rule out anything, no matter how, even the idea of, in the outside artwork, all the lyrics being just abstract works of art, none of them are readable at all, which he's kind of PR people were up in arms about that at one stage. They just said, how can you have nobody be able to read your lyrics? But just being able to create them as just pure works of art were and how that was going to happen, and how that was going to look on the paper, all of those things he was completely involved in. He wasn't someone who just sat on the touchline. So yeah.
Amazing. And on the very cover of your Starman Tarot, what's coming out, is indeed Starman as Bowie, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said earlier, if you look at it, it's kind of like, it's sort of Bowie but not Bowie, and I didn't want it to be like, a portrait of David Bowie.
It's an archetype. Got it.
Absolutely, and I kind of stand by that, really, because in some respects I think it would have been even easier to have just said, what, this is kind of going to be portraits of David Bowie and my rendition of it, but I really wanted to step away from doing stuff like that. So what you see there is really my what came to me as the archetype of the Starman. It was never, in some ways I even did my utmost to not make it David Bowie. Which kind of sounds, again, paradoxical, but the more I got into that archetype, and the more I created around it, that's just the way it was. So it came out like that. It almost designed itself.
This also brings into reference the fact that no matter where David's soul is, I think he inspires us today as much as he ever did, and he's one of those extremely rare original artists, and I've had arguments with people who don't believe in original artists. I do. He's one of those original artists who, there's nobody like him. There's nobody who will ever be like him, because he's a true original, and he will inspire people forever. And I think that in a way, your work is a great testament to that. And the fact that you've worked with him and stuff is an amazing experience. And all I can tell the audience is get the tarot deck. There's going to be 3 versions of it and a bag. There's a limited edition bag that's available too for pre-order at this point and for order later on. And these editions include, they're all very beautiful editions. There's the limited edition, the one with the booklet, and the one with the little book, right?
Yeah, there's 3 versions. There's the deck version, which is kind of like your, it's just like a deck of cards, but it is, it's still beautifully finished and packaged. Then there's what they call the kit version, which has the booklet, the cards, and the lightning strike box. And then there's the limited edition, which has these 2 added extra things, and the cards are bigger. They've got various other finishes on them and stuff like that. So the whole presentation of the limited edition one is kind of like it's a very unique one-off presentation, and there's only 3,000 of those ever available. So after they've gone, that's kind of it for the rest of eternity, as if it were.
I'm wondering.
It's scary. It sounds a bit scary.
I'm wondering if what your what definition would be like. I feel like truly original artists are individually connected to the collective unconscious. They're just in the river of it. They swim through it. They catch the fish from it, etc. And then there's many people who kind of like try to reprocess things and get things from thin air or force them out of themselves, and that's not originality. What would you consider to be artistic originality?
Wow, that's an amazing question. I think it's probably a little bit of all of the things that you've described in that last sentence. For me, it's the ability to kind of seize upon something that has, it's a bit like has a scent to it, has a trail to it, and follow it through. And it's kind of like like even when working with Bowie, there was always that sense of kind of diving off a cliff and building wings on the way down. So I think for me, creativity is the willingness to kind of risk everything in the process of creating, and also the kind of the willingness to fail spectacularly if you fail to build those wings on the way down, which is always a possibility. So it's kind of the abandonment of this kind of safety net mentality, and there's, when you're really in that energy, it's kind of the fear of failure. It's not that the fear of failure goes away, but it's always present. It's always present with you, and your willingness to step into that space where, like really something unexpected can transpire, and when you see that little spark of something, that the willingness to seize upon it and go into it, fearlessly go into it, no matter where it's going to take you. That is what creativity is about for me, and I totally agree with you about Bowie. I think that he was willing to do that again and again and again and again, and I think his whole life was a testament to that process, right the way up to Black Star, and beyond now. I mean, you could say that even with stuff like the Starman Tarot, that energy that he ignited is still ricocheting through reality and will continue. So he embodied the creative archetype, the Starman archetype. He really lived it right the way up to the very end, which is a true artist in my opinion.
I agree with you completely. And the encore question, if you could talk to the Starman up above right now, what would you say to Bowie if he could hear you?
Oh, wow. God, I have no idea what I would say to him. I'd probably just ask him a question. I'd probably just ask him what it's like to be dead.
That would be a very good question to know. I think we would all appreciate that answer. Thank you so much for being on the Archetypal Mosaic. David De Angelis, tarot deck available this year, and of course every year after that, hopefully, and it's 3 varieties publicly and the little bag that comes along that you can buy separately. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Really my pleasure, and thank you so much for asking me those amazing questions. They've really helped me to think about things myself, so thank you so much.
Thank you.